Anyway, hearing of residents. Did anybody sign up? Nobody? Okay. Makes it easier. Consent agenda. Item 4A, minutes of the November 13th, 2019 regular meeting. Item B is PC 2019-041. Consider and act upon a request for approval of final plat of the Blackburn subdivision, an approximately 3.07 acre tract of land generally located 650 feet southeast of the intersection of L Bell Road and FM 3009, City of Schertz, Guadalupe County. C is PC 2018-003. Consider and act upon a request for the approval of the final plat of Crossvine Module 2, Unit 1 subdivision, an approximately 15-acre tract of land generally located approximately 1,000 feet southwest of the intersection of 1518 and Lower Seguin Road, City of Schertz, Bear County, Texas. Anybody have any of the items want pulled? If not, Chair will entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve the consent agenda as it's been presented.
Second.
Motion by Richard, second by Glenn. Approve the consent agenda as presented. Call for vote.
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Item 5, workshop and discussion on driveways and curb cut.
We'll tag team on this one. Last meeting, or I think the last meeting, maybe the meeting before, during the comments at the end, commissioners had questions about kind of how we review driveway requirements, driver approach requirements. And I think in particular it was, you may recall, there was an appeal that came before Planning and Zoning Commission for the little commercial development up at Schertz Parkway in Woodland Oaks, the smaller tract, the north side of it. Staff recommended denial of that, and then there was a question that came through that, hey, I see Clemens is cutting in the drive approach. It's real close to the intersection. Kind of, hey, what's Upton saying, why some people get them, why some people don't, what's the criteria. So we'll have John kind of start with the first part, talking about here's what the code says, here's what we kind of look at, here's why. You know, because one of the questions is, maybe sitting there going, why does it even matter? What's the big deal about giving somebody a driver approach, as long as it's not sort of unsafe for some reason? What's it kind of matter? And I think we'll talk through that. What are the implications of driver approach, why you want to limit them, how to affect them. And then we'll kind of get into, and I'll kind of step one other part to talk about the tools that we got here, kind of what the concerns we had on the Woodland Oaks one were, what the factors were with the school district one was that prompted us to go that way, and kind of talk about, well, you can have this criteria, and at some point it's a bit of judgment, a bit of trying to predict what drivers do, things like that.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm John Nowak. For those of you that don't know me, I think this is the second time I've been before this group. Start off with what's in our Unified Development Code with respect to drive approaches. And there's actually a piece in here that is in a section where you normally wouldn't expect to find it. And we do utilize this. It's not directly related to drive approaches per se, but it is one of the tools in our toolbox to help kind of manage access to our roadways. And that is a requirement that when we're dealing with commercial developments, that if somebody's coming in and platting a whole bunch of lots, they don't necessarily get a drive approach at every single lot. They have to provide cross-access easements will require them to share drive approaches to try to minimize the amount of drive approaches we have on some of our roadways. Another section of the UDC, and this is one that came into play with the Woodland Oaks property in particular, that if you have a piece of property that's on a principal arterial that has access to another public roadway, then they cannot have access onto that primary or that secondary arterial. They need to take access off the other roadway instead. And then we have a general section that gives some specific technical requirements on driveways, like the maximum size they can be, drive approach spacing, and it references the city's design guide, and there's additional requirements in the design guide that we'll talk about here in just a few slides that further refines where you can have drive approaches, how they have to be built, and those kinds of things. And then there's another section, because with a lot of ordinances, particularly with one like this, it's virtually impossible to create something that's going to work everywhere all the time. So in the UDC is a provision that allows for deviation from these requirements, provided they meet certain criteria. And we'll kind of talk through that process here as we go on. Why does drive approach spacing and location matter? We're concerned about where they are and how they're spaced, primarily for safety and efficiency of our roadways. If you start to think about driving down some streets, not necessarily in Schertz, but in our area, the more you have on a given road, the slower sometimes you have to go, or the longer it takes you to get from point A to point B on that road. And that's because you've got a lot of drive approaches, so you've got a lot of cars slowing down to turn into them in particular. That tends to back up traffic a little bit on the road. And so the other side of the coin is people want to get from here to there. They want to go to that building or that particular business, so they want a drive approach that gets them there as quickly as possible. So it's always a balancing act. How much access do you allow on a given street versus how much traffic do you need to move or safely move excuse me, down that road. So with a drive approach, there are some inherent things with it that we would all say are less than desirable. You have an increased opportunity for vehicle, pedestrian, or bicyclist conflicts because they're driving across where cars turning into it. Because of the approach itself, you often have a change in the surface, the walking surface. And while we're required to have tapers that can't exceed certain slopes, so they're navigable, you're still changing elevation to go across there. What are some of the things that led to the requirements that we have? Excuse me. Number one is the functional classification of the street. A local street, the primary role of a local street is to provide access. If you think about a residential subdivision, that means you have a drive approach once every 50 feet. You have larger lots, they can be spaced out a little bit more, but having one every 50 feet, and if you think about driving into a neighborhood, say you live at the far end of the street, and you're behind all of your neighbors, how long is it going to take you to get to your house, having to be behind them, waiting for each one of them to turn into their driveway going down? That's kind of important to kind of keep in your mind as we talk about the next classification street and then the one after that. Next classification is collectors. Now, collectors do two things. They provide access, but they also are intended to move people around the community to get them access to arterials and other parts of the community. So they kind of serve a dual purpose. So in those cases, you do have drive approaches, but we try to space them out a lot further. Our requirement is on the order of 200 feet as a minimum spacing requirement. That's 4 times the distance that what you typically have on a local street in a residential community. The next classification is arterial streets. Now, the primary function of arterials is to move traffic, get people from point A to point B. But they also have businesses and things they like to locate on because of that traffic, so you do have to provide some access. But you really want to try to space the access out as much as possible on those. And so our requirements double the spacing requirement for a collector, or make it roughly 8 times the spacing requirement of a local residential street, or 400 feet. You're really trying to space them out. And you can kind of think of an analogy too if we look at our highway system, not just freeways, but all of our highways. You know, you have the freeways like I-35 and I-10. How far apart are the exits on those? They don't like them any closer than a mile. If you move on to a secondary highway, like Highway 46 or 306, FM 306, some of those types of rural roadways, you have more access points. But if you look at what happened like on 281, for example, that started out as a 2-lane highway. More development, more traffic, added more and more lanes, but you still have all those access points. And it creates all these bottlenecks. And now there's a major project to convert that to more of a freeway section. So that's kind of how access and regular traffic, moving traffic, kind of relate to each other, and why a lot of municipalities develop rules and requirements to try to strike that balance for that community. We'll get into the design guide requirements here. We have different classifications of approaches in the design guide. You have one set of standards for residential and a different set of standards for commercial. Commercial approaches tend to be much larger because they're accommodating two-way traffic, and in some cases, depending on the use of the property, they're accommodating much larger vehicles, so you need more room to get them in and out. So a residential lot has minimum and maximum width. You're only allowed one per lot unless you have a larger lot that has at least 100 feet of frontage or more. Then you could have a second approach to have like a circular driveway. But a smaller lot, you only get one. Non-residential approaches are all everything else that is out there that's not single-family residential. And we restrict the number of approaches depending on the classification roadway that we're talking about. You have one approach per 200 feet of frontage if you're on a collector, one per 400 if you're on an arterial. We also have a minimum distance from an intersection. And that can vary a little bit because not all of our intersections are equal. You have a major roadway or an arterial intersection, you have a lot more stuff going on, and you want the approach to be further away from there, particularly if you have left turn lanes. You don't want an approach coming out where you've got a left turn bay. You want to make that approach beyond that to try to reduce the conflict. If you're talking about just a local residential street and a local residential street, they can be closer to the intersection because you don't have as much volume, you don't have as much stuff going on. And here again, the design guide further reinforces what's in the UDC, that if you have a smaller commercial lot, you have to have cross-access easements, again, to reduce the number of approaches and try to share them as much as possible. Another thing that comes into play is sight distance. And there's a variety of factors that come into sight distance. Vehicle speed or posted speed limit on the road, the terrain, you have a sharp curve, it's hard to see a car coming. You know, both for the vehicle traveling down the road, seeing a car coming out of the driveway, and the person trying to leave the driveway makes it difficult. The greater the speed on the road, the longer your stopping distance is, so the greater your sight distance needs to be. Everything kind of relates to it. How do we implement all of these requirements that we have? We kind of have a flow chart process, if you will. When we get a submittal, we look at it. Is it fully compliant with all of our requirements? If it is, easy. We can stamp it, approve, and move on to the next one. If it's not, then we need to to talk about it a little more. We need to do something different. So when we talk about it more, the first step is can full compliance be achieved with what they're trying to do? If the answer is yes, then we send a comment out to the applicant saying, you need to change your plans to fully comply with our requirements. Here's our requirements. Here's where what you're proposing doesn't meet our requirements. If they come back and say, we can't do that, or if we look at it in our analysis, say, man, there's no way they can fully comply with our requirements, then we have to dig a little deeper. Why is that? If they can't fully comply, then that's when we look at, okay, when we grant a waiver, is it reasonable to grant a waiver from these requirements to allow this to move forward? When we talk about considering these waiver of requirements, some of the things that we consider are how close to full compliance is it? We're talking about a situation where our minimum spacing requirement is 400 feet, but because of the way some existing lots have developed before, we had that requirement. Now this lot's coming in to develop. This approach location isn't exactly 400 feet, but it's 385 feet. It's 390 feet. Is that close enough to compliance? That's one consideration. Are there factors prohibiting full compliance with our requirements that are kind of beyond the control of the applicant? Redevelopment of an existing site. You already have a site. You already have stuff around it. You're trying to redevelop it. Sometimes you can't fully comply with all of our requirements. Is there an issue related to emergency access? Now, I want to make it very clear that we do not have a requirement that says you have to have an approach for emergency access. What we mean by related to it is you have to have certain fire lane requirements on your site. Depending on how big your site is, how it's structured, the fire trucks have to be able to get in and be able to get out. Sometimes the site is so constrained that there's not enough room for a hammerhead or turnaround or a full looped fire lane. Sometimes you have to consider a second approach to be able to comply with the fire code requirement. Very rare, but it's out there. We also consider traffic patterns around the site and traffic patterns internal to the site. Sometimes because of the way a parking lot is laid out or things like that, that cars need to come in here, but they need to get out at a different location. So where you'd really like to have only one approach, sometimes you need that second approach for cars to get out. Sometimes because of other things, a particular property may not be able to take access from another location like we really wanted. An example of that is along Schertz Parkway. Ideally, they even built an approach off of the other street other than Schertz Parkway. It wasn't until they went to start using it that they discovered there was a sliver of property that was maintained, that was owned by the HOA of the residential subdivision. And access for them was prohibited. They could not cross that piece. Had no choice then. They had to take access off of Schertz Parkway. Other agencies also come into play. And what I mean by other agencies is when we deal with TxDOT, for example, on TxDOT facilities, sometimes we would prefer that they don't get an access point here or there, but they've already gone to TxDOT before they come to us. And TxDOT has approved an approach at this location. We can't really override TxDOT in a situation like that. And another thing we mean by other agencies' influence is if we're dealing with like another governmental entity, like a school district, for example, or a school property, we can do things a little bit differently. We can try something out. If it's not working, we can work with them to make adjustments after something's built. We don't always have that luxury with a private development or a commercial property. Once it's done, and you're stuck with it. You don't get an opportunity in most cases to be able to go back and make changes after the fact like you can with other entities out one final question that we always ask before we recommend approving a waiver or granting a waiver is, will this approach function acceptably? It may be less than ideal, it may not be perfect, it may not do everything we want it to do, but will it work without causing a big detriment to the community? We can answer that last question. That's when we tend to say, okay, we'll grant this waiver. With that, we'll kind of look at some examples, and we'll try to pick some kind of recent ones.
Let's pull up Google Maps. And that might help the commission, because I think we'll show you the WellMed example real quick, just to make sure we're all on the same page. No, it's working because you're here. That's in fact what it's doing. Primitive navigation. So the WellMed site that John referenced, and I'll zoom in real quick. This site right here. So again, you've got Community Circle coming through here. You've got the Chamber Building right here. Live Oak comes in right here. Here you have Schertz Parkway. As you can see, initially, as he said, they were constructing a drive approach on Kramer Parkway, only to discover that they didn't actually own, I think it was a 1-foot strip of land up against the right of way, which then, because they didn't have frontage on that, we had to go back and do the drive approach on Schertz Parkway, where it likely would have been ideal to be here. So I want to be clear, and you guys who've been on this walk can probably think of other cases where we've had issues or controversies, problems with drive approaches. One that you may not have been aware of, and it was a little bit different because it was a private street subdivision coming in, had to do with the med clinic that went in behind kind of HEB, so off 3009 on Forest Ridge Parkway, and Commissioner Outlaw may have been at the city staff then. There was an issue with them and their accessibility and where they needed it. Again, John talked about that concept of shared access with Bush's Chicken. They also wanted a drive approach here. It was an issue with that having been granted. There's only 2 districts in the private street. So, again, we at times have these controversies and problems that come in. We've had certainly other situations, and we talked about this, where we've done drive approaches, but they've been limited to right in, right out only. So there's some circumstances where we look at these factors and we say, it doesn't fit the norm, and so we do something a little bit different. One of, I think, the ones that's been a bit of a challenge is this with the assisted living center and the daycare, and that drive approach that's intended to be a ride out. If you sit here, you'll notice people sit there and make a left coming out of it. The other one that we've had some challenges with, if I can recall, has been on the other side of 35 off Mid-City Parkway. The same situation here with, again, a second drive approach. But that was intended to be a ride-out only. You have people who at times pulling up their cars on that little island there. So part of it is how you design, how you construct, what people are really trying to do, balancing those out. Just as a few examples of, while we have these 2 recent ones we're talking about, staff regularly deals with issues of access. The real contentious one we had for a while was the redevelopment of about wanting them to remove a number of those drive approaches at the Garden Ridge site, and that was a big deal for them. So you can see the number that they've got, and then compare that to sort of what Walmart even has relatively, the same size. And so with the redevelopment of this portion, an agreement was reached that they would reduce that down the road. So, you struggle with the stuff, you try to fix it. The last one I'll show you, and then we'll show the Woodland Oaks. I think this was on staff's mind, probably to some degree, as we were going through this process, is the doctor's office right there at Savannah and Schertz Parkway. You may recall that went in, and they've got a drive approach on Schertz Parkway, they've got a drive approach on Savannah, and often that doctor now, despite various warnings, will get out there and barricade that to avoid cut-through traffic in that location. Particular concern because there's a massive footstep walk in this area. People trying to avoid the light on Schertz Parkway go down to Savannah. It becomes an issue. And we regularly run into these things. But I'll show you real quick, and then John can go back to the PowerPoint and talk about the site that we're dealing with. And you may not recognize this site today, and I've certainly had some conversations with some of you. You may recall that this is what the site looked like. Head out of here, you will realize most of those trees are gone. Cleared the site, they've taken a bunch of cut from it. But this was the site in question that we were talking about with this first case. And I'll let John.
With this one, when they requested the approach off Schertz Parkway, we had some concerns. We had concerns about cut-through traffic. And in particular, that's kind of on the north side of that intersection. You have a lot of people wanting to turn right anyway. You see cars lined up on Woodland Oaks. People see it as a relief valve and try to cut through. They know they can get to the Parkway and avoid that. That was one of those things, and we did realize, or we did recognize that further up the road, they tried a second approach, and we were afraid that was going to happen, and sure enough, it happened. We didn't want to duplicate that problem with this location. And if that side only had that driveway on the Schertz Parkway, you'd have U-turns occurring at the nose of the median there. People will see the driveway there, they're coming from the north, that's the way they gotta go to get in. Even if they still had two approaches, had the approach on Woodland Oaks, having that approach there would not eliminate that behavior. Driving down the street, particularly from the north, I want to get to that building over there. There's an approach there. I'm going to flip a U-turn to take it. Particularly the first time you go there, you may not even know that there's another approach off the Woodland. So that was a concern with that one. The site we're talking about is also fairly small. It's not like a large multi-lot development where you have a lot of traffic loading, where you're trying to split the loading into multiple locations too, rather so you don't jam up one spot or another. That wasn't at this site. The site was fairly small. And we started out with an undeveloped site, so we weren't dealing with a redevelopment situation where we're having to try to make something fit and stay within what we already had. We're starting with a blank sheet of paper, and so we could say, no, we really need to make sure this thing is built according to our requirements.
How we look at subdivision oftentimes will express the concern, and you'll talk about traffic. My reaction is, why would you design something that's going to create a problem along the front of the other? Why would you not redesign it and avoid those concerns? I think it's a little bit of that, a bit of a blank, why create a problem
if we look at Clemens, we have an existing developed site. They've been adding to their site. They've been growing. They've been experiencing growth much like our community has. So it's a little bit different than the Woodland Oak situation. We're trying to make things work on something that already has buildings and stuff on it.
To be clear, as citizens, it wasn't like somehow this drive approach is going to fix all the problems. You're still going to have problems. Crossing Schertz Parkway, Woodland, well, when you work here and you go up here certain times, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you get this mass of kids that walk through our campus, walk the pedestrian bridge over the bridge, walk through the complex. Clear. It wasn't as though we said, hey, let's add this thing and all our problems are solved. It deals with one element of the problem. Again, I think likely what we see in the renovation, when they've settled, we'll likely go back and
This site is also a very large site. It's nearly 49 acres. You have 3,000 students coming and going from the campus. A little bit different than just a small 10,000 square foot office building site like at Woodland Oak. If you look at just the lot itself and look at our requirements, they've got more than enough frontage on there to have 2 approaches. And so it's kind of hard to say, no, you can't have another one when they meet the requirement for being able to have more than one. The location of the approach is not ideal. I think we all recognize that. The approach is also not being constructed to be a full access approach. It's intended to be a right-in, right-out. It also has a gate on it where there will be periods of time that's not available. It's not going to be available 24/7 like a regular commercial approach would be. We don't have a raised median at this location, so we don't have the U-turn potential. Even though we do what we can to try to make it a right-in, right-out, is there somebody that's going to sit there in Schertz Parkway and try to turn left into that? Possibly. And that, short of us getting in everybody's car and driving them through, we can't 100% control driver behavior. We can do what we can and try to handle the vast majority of it, but it's one of these things that, if we put this on the ground and we see problems, we still do have an opportunity to go back to the school and say, hey, we need to make some modifications here. We need to change the shape of that island. Maybe we need to add some of those reflector bouncy poles on that island to try to further discourage or prohibit that behavior if that in fact does become a problem. We have those types of things, and if you look at the site overall, you look at what they're trying to accomplish with the parking lot, you can kind of make a case for it's better to have some of the cars coming in at one location, getting into this new parking area, and leaving another location. The traffic flows a little better. And because you have a lot of traffic on this site, much like a large commercial site, in a perfect world, you may think, send everybody in and out one location and only one location. That creates its own set of bottlenecks and own set of issues. Sometimes it's actually better if you have multiple ways to get in and out of a large site like that. Spread the load out. Much like with our transportation system overall in our network. If you look at our master thoroughfare plan, there's other road routes identified on that. And the reason for that is the existing road system can't take all the traffic. We need to have more places for the traffic to go. And the same concept applies if you're looking at just a commercial site or a large site. It's better to have more ways in and out so you're not creating a bottleneck just at one location.
So maybe in summary, correct me if I'm mistaken. When we looked at the site at Woodland Oaks, you had a standard that said because they could get a drive approach on the road, they couldn't get one. The standard we have says they couldn't get one. We evaluated the cases of why it would benefit. And we had a couple reasons, we may not agree with them. There was a logic to passing about cut-through traffic, about because we're not comfortable deviating from what the standard says. Because of the issue we have with Clemens is if you look at some of the standards, they've got almost 1,000 feet of frontage. Presently, they just have the one drive approach on Parkway. A much bigger side is already developed. The real issue there is proximity to the intersection. It doesn't meet the standard. And I'll go back real quick. Again, this is a bit of a sort of struggle is, you have a couple of things at play, and again, some of these you may have, feel more comfortable about coming in. So again, the drive approach you've got is kind of right here, right now. It leads to this parking lot here that we understand teacher parking. I would say normally have a greater comfort with teachers following the rules of the road as opposed to students, but you may recall as we had issues with people parking at the library, it was both teachers and students doing it, so it doesn't always work that way. But to bump back, we run into a problem with Mitchell. We've got this spacing issue that's a constraint. So that's a challenge. It's not as though, it's real easy to move it and all our problems are solved. We start butting up against Mitchell, which is about 275 from the intersection. Now we've got this deal of we want those, we've all dealt with those intersections that aren't directly there, but they're not far enough, and so you're kind of going, what are they going to do? Do I turn in front? Do I turn behind them? That's a bit of the issue that I think was a factor there. And I'll say this, and this is where you guys may say, we don't. The reality is, it's a school that, and this is the school district's problem to solve. It's a relatively tight site for a high school with this many students going. If you look on an aerial photo, compare this to Steele, it's a much smaller site. It's got more students in Steele. It's going to grow. The only solution to deal with that is voting for a bond for $120, $130, $140 million to build a third high school for the population. The realities of this requirement to educate our children is you've got to have this stuff. And if you look at the site, the only sort of open area they've got they use for activities is right here. And so how much do we want to truly affect the functionality of that school by saying it's so critical that we meet the spacing standard that we're going to send this thing down here? Now we need enough sites. So again, not a perfect solution. Those were the factors that played a role to say we're going to allow this not complying with that distance requirement. Don't know that making the use of distance requirements doesn't create a real problem. It really serves going. Hopefully that explains some of the logic.
That was really my last slide of the presentation. I was just
Okay. Anybody questions? Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for the information. And Brian, I do feel better knowing because I was going to ask, is it teacher parking or student parking? Teacher parking I'm a little more comfortable with. And I appreciate the explanation and the rationale. And I hope you realize that I've never been a fan of one-size-fits-all rules. And one of the biggest complaints that we've heard for a long time over the UDC is its inflexibility. There's no discretion left to staff. And we've been trying to fix that slowly but surely. I don't want to say I disagree with what you're doing down there at the school. I realize there are, as you say, you're trying to make it fit. And the reality is eventually they're going to run out of space. They're going to have to either build another school or send the kids someplace else. My goal, my concern is the fair and equitable application of the UDC to all developers and applicants. That's what I'm after. And it's nice that we remember our mistakes and learn from them. And again, the argument about Woodland Oaks, why would you create when you can see problems, why would you let it happen in the first place? Okay, I'll give you that one. I wasn't going to say it, but I have to say it. The doctor's office on the corner of Savannah and Schertz Parkway, I drive that intersection a lot, okay? Now, under construction, he had that driveway barricaded. But since he's been open, I have never seen him barricade either entrance to that facility. So, again, I'm not there every day. I'm not there 24 hours a day. He may do it and I don't see him, but anyway. So, my concern goes back to April, when we considered, when the Woodland Oaks issue was brought to us as an appeal. And for most of the meeting, for most of the discussion, I was the dissenter. And, the way the votes were going to happen, it didn't matter which way I went to vote. But back then, staff was adamant that the UDC says you shall take access off the other street. It doesn't say may, it says shall. And being a code guy for a many number of years, that means you got to do it. You don't have a choice. So where did we, and this is going to sound wrong, and I apologize, but where was the authority for staff to waive that requirement and approve that driveway access onto Schertz Parkway? I think that's part of the confusion. On one hand, you guys are telling me the UDC says you can't do it, and then 6 months later you're doing it. So,
Yeah, so let me kind of give you this. This is not a technical answer, and you may kind of go, yeah, I hear you.
that's all right.
I'll sort of give you the way we approach it. And truly, this is sort of it. We've understood that, yeah, there's this desire that a hard, fast UDC that doesn't have flexibility, we can argue is fair. Everybody's treated the same way, everybody gets the consumers, isn't the way we want to go as a community. And you can't necessarily develop a standard for one size fits all. There are all of these other factors that come into play, that why we have professional consumers judgment, and then kind of moving on. And I will say this in this circumstance, and I'll go back to what I said. We approached it from the code initially. We're not supposed to get one off. We looked at it and said, does it make sense to allow it? If we had allowed it, we wouldn't have taken that. We would have allowed it. We would have given them the drive approach, and that's how we operate presently. Yeah, you can probably find shall in the code. You need to be taking it to us, and that's something we can have a separate conversation about, or we can have as part of this. But the way we've operated is, if staff is comfortable with this drive approach, we'll grant it, even if it doesn't comply with the criteria, if we have a comfort level. If we don't, y'all are the relief valve to say, yeah, thanks, staff, I think you're being overly concerned with the fact. But we can certainly have that conversation as to what do we want to do going forward with this, is either to say, yeah, I hear you, start bringing those to us, and I can respect that, or hey, let's adjust the code, so now we're following the code and we're not going one way or the other. I can appreciate that. I'm just giving you the honest answer. The way we've operated is, if we're okay with it, we'll approve it. If we're not, the appeal has to come to you guys. That's the way it lays out. And that's how we've operated. We have a few other things we take because the code's specific and it's been issues. So the median in residential subdivisions goes to TSAC for a reference bill, correct? And we're taking those to you guys because that's been an issue that we've had that's hit TSAC and P&Z about limited access and things like that to continue. Otherwise, this is one that technically it falls in the right-of-way, purview of the city engineer.
Well, and I certainly don't want to have, in the past, we've delegated I say we, I certainly wasn't on the commission, but the commission has delegated certain tasks to staff in order to streamline the process and speed things up. And I'm okay with that. But we just went through, and I don't necessarily agree with everything the legislature did, but the whole idea or the thought behind it was that if I'm going to deny something, I have to have a valid reason to deny it, and take out all this arbitrary capriciousness, subjectivity, okay? And unfortunately, that's what I'm hearing, okay? The code says, and let me finish because I've got a better thought for you, and it really goes back to the engineer. On one hand, to tell us they can't do it, but on the other hand, you do it, okay? And staff, all the things they consider, okay? It still comes down to their judgment versus what the code says.
Or your judgment,
Okay.
if you do.
Yes. Now, this parking lot already has two access points. It has one off the curved driveway going in front of the high school, and it has one onto L Bell. Okay? That's gated. It's you see it if you bring your map up, you'll see it. It's where the old portables were. And I'm not sure it would be any better to have that dumping onto L Bell, because now you got all those people that would have gone up Schertz Parkway. Yeah. So I'm kind of rambling, but the idea is I get what you guys are saying. Is L Bell an arterial? Would it? I think in my mind it looks like it would be an arterial. I don't know.
It's not the same.
Okay.
It's not a primary like Schertz Parkway.
All right. Well, because I was just, and your argument about, I hadn't thought about it. If they're entitled, although the code doesn't say that, it doesn't matter that they only have one driveway onto Schertz Parkway. That's an arterial. If they have access to a side street, the code says they shall use it. So I'm kind of going around here in circles, Brian, but again, what I would like to see, and I've tried writing this stuff before. I know it's not easy. Just talk to me about trying to write a fire lane ordinance and what does parking mean, okay? But I would like to see us come up with a code that has some flexibility in it, that allows the adaptation for unique situations. Because where I'm coming from right now, and I hope you understand, is that we said yes here, we said no here, and now we're saying yes down here. And when I look at the UDC, all three of those should have been no. So that's my concern. It's not necessarily with the end result, because I really appreciate, the explanation was great, and it makes all the sense in the world, okay? But I used to tell my inspector and my deputy fire marshals, both of them, that if it's not in the code, you can't make it up. Okay, this is what the code says. If you don't like it, amend it. You can't just on the fly. So I hope you understand that's where I'm coming from. I do appreciate the explanation. It makes total sense, including the one why we said no to Woodland Oaks. There were a couple of things came up that weren't in the original discussion that make it that decision made more sense today than it did 6 months ago. So thank you.
So let me offer this up, because I think this is a bit of our struggle. So I certainly don't disagree that, hey, let's clean the code up to reference what we want to do in practice. That says, here's the standard, rethink the shalls, shoulds, we lay out the criteria for staff to be able to grant drive approaches or not, and so that very clearly we go, look, we've got this code, this is what it says, we're clearly following within those lines. I can certainly appreciate that. I will say I think some of the concern I've got is a little bit, and this may just be my perception, and it goes back to kind of what brought this up and some of the comments I've heard from folks since then is, and I'll use a couple terms used, is this fairness issue versus this equity issue. Fairness really is, to commercial collector, that fairness really is, it's the same standard for everybody. Black and white, it's hard, fast, you get it, you don't, we apply it, it's non-judgmental, in the story, you're done. Whereas equitable says every situation is different. And to apply the same standard to different circumstances and say, this is what you get, it's the same thing, doesn't have the same implication to people, and so to that degree, it's not equitable. And I guess I'm just asking as we look to move forward is the commission really going to be comfortable with those, an ordinance that at some point, with that flexibility, in our judgment, for reasons, we're saying we're going to not allow something here, and we would allow something here because we think those factors are different that come into play. And I mean that sincerely, because I think some of what I gathered from the discussion, there seemed, and fair enough, seemed to be this inherent, how do we tell one person yes and one person no? And that's okay to struggle with that, but if that's the case, then we really need to have that hard, fast standard. It is what it is, because otherwise I think we'll end up not kind of following the spirit, or struggling to follow the spirit. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, I understand completely what you're saying. So that brings up a little bit different question then, because I think what we're talking about is the standard 100% of the time says no. If you want a yes, put your arguments together and go to P&Z, like the Woodland Oaks guy did. And
Yeah, so, and I'm sorry, because I want to be clear. So yeah, what it says is if it doesn't meet, please, you want to show Glenn, and I'm not being this because I certainly, oh yeah, that's great. Because I currently couldn't stand up here and say, and I will say this, I think one of the things that, and staff will kind of grunt as I do this, we have times where code says something and we're going to make a judgment call and we're going to say, but I'm going to do this. And again, the example I use is, can you stand there with the mayor, explain to him why you did what you did? Can you stand there with the TV reporter? Can you stand there with your mother? Can you stand there with your pastor or priest and say, yep, this is why I made that call, so that we don't kind of forget the human side of it. And so I want to be clear, not going to sit here and go, oh, see, we found this, see, we're not violating, because we have other things where I go, yep, this is how we're going to do it.
well, it's all right. It's
Yeah,
legible.
essentially allows staff to approve something that doesn't meet, if it doesn't meet.
Right here, referring to the driveways, there's a specific waiver allowed.
Okay. And you had that under driveways on your slide, but is that a different section than the one that says thou shalt take the access off the side street? Is my question.
Different section.
Right. This is about the driveway.
Well, you don't need to find it.
I think
You've
your
answered my
point's well
question.
taken.
Further up on
We
the
could
same
tighten up the
section.
code to put it all in one section to make very clear.
Okay.
I
So-
don't disagree.
So, what does that say that and you don't need to put it back up there again. I'm just trying to come up with a word. So that says the city manager or his designee can approve it. And if he disapproves it, then they can appeal to us, which I think is the right approach. And probably what messed me up, because I'm not trying to be vindictive or personal, but again, I struggle up here where we just said no and now we're saying yes. And I'm just trying to reconcile that in my own little head up here. So I went, when I read the staff memo says, according to this section of the UDC, you can't do this. It never led me to the section.
That gives us. I can appreciate that. I will say, I think our struggle is still the same, and see if you would agree, is that as much as we say at times, I think when we say that we get frustrated with the rigidity of the code,
Yeah.
the lack of flexibility, we kind of go, I wish it was more flexible with allowed judgment. But are we really comfortable then with making those different decisions as we apply all of the factors to this set of criteria that the code gives us the ability to? Or if we say staff can approve this or the commission can approve this, are we going to struggle with, well, we told this person no, we told this person yes? Even if we had reasons to do that, and I mean this sincerely, is that something that's going to be an issue for us? Because it may affect how we want to approach this going forward, and I'm sensing that's part of it from the commission.
Well, you know, experience, it's always difficult when you make exceptions that, you know, whenever I did that as the fire marshal, I always tried to make sure I had valid, defensible, documented, so that if it ever came up again, I can say, no, that's not the same. You know, exactly, arbitrary and
Which
capricious.
is why I agree, you ought to have this standard say, if you're
So-
going to deviate, either way, to not allow out, this is the
Okay.
criteria.
The real problem here is I'm not as knowledgeable of the UDC as I should be. I probably should have been aware, and believe it or not, I've probably read that section that Lisa just brought up. It's just,
So if I can cut in, let me say something else, and here's something to think about. You guys may really knee-jerk on this. Other communities, this decision with regard to drive approaches, fundamentally which section you put it in, P&Z and council have no say in it. It entirely falls with engineering staff
yeah,
because of the fact that they're the ones most well-versed in these sort of issues. If we don't like the outcome, then the code can be changed by those bodies, but in its application,
yeah.
solely falls to this person or this department that has these factors in deference a little bit. So just something to keep in mind too.
And the reality is, we as commissioners place a lot of faith in staff and the planners. For instance, we approved on the consent agenda tonight, I guess they're both plats, right? Final plats, without any question, trusting that staff had done and everything was 100% okay. We take your word for it.
Can I say this real quick?
Sure.
I appreciate that, and I will tell you, I think staff takes that very seriously well, and I'll give you two examples. Emily forgot to notice a case one time going to council, and stood up to council and said, I erred on this, I dropped the ball. I think anybody on council had a problem, but it was important to her to go on record. I messed this thing up, I forgot to give a notice. Now, why do you go to council, read council agendas? I think it was last week, James Walters put in a written item clarifying what San Antonio's utility rates were.
Right.
Even though it was saying, oh, I erred on it being low, it's actually higher, which sort of supports my case.
Yeah.
I didn't give you the right information. It's a big enough deal to him that he wanted to do an update to council, so he went on record. So, and we'll tell you, staff takes it very seriously as well.
Okay.
While John was on his phone pulling up what L-Bell was, because it
Well,
was important to get it right.
And let me apologize for making you do all that work, because the simple answer was the one that Lisa brought up to the podium after, you know.
So it took her to pull it up and show.
Because that's what I was wrestling with, Brian, was who gets to say yes? Well, now I know. And so, I know the guy on the end, because he always accuses me of talking too much anyway. As far as I'm concerned, we've resolved this issue. Between the information the two of you have provided and the section that Lisa pointed out, I'm okay. I mean, it's been explained to me, and I know in it, and I will say I think I like the way, I think we should continue to do that way. Thank you.
The original developer of the property, when he laid it out, he told us he wanted to get a service station at that corner. And we told him it was too small and he had to get a bigger lot, which meant cutting out a house if he didn't want to do it. Anyway, we lost, and it stayed empty for 20 years. Garden Ridge Pottery.
Parkway, as I recall from the one at Live Oak.
Garden Ridge Pottery was not in the city originally,
Just a different time, different, not being critical, just
you know, and it's,
we have these.
at the time, he legally, the only one that had any kind of say on driveways was TxDOT. He was the only building up there, so they gave him several driveways.
I would like to say we enjoy a very good working relationship, in my opinion, with TxDOT. We were able to work with them on that case in particular, and we got nearly half of those drive approaches that were there eliminated with that. So I count that as a win. Does it still fully meet all of our requirements? No. Is it better than it was? Yes. Somewhat better.
Somewhat. Okay. Anybody else have any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
I think we should have allowed a driveway access on the Parkway for that Woodland Oaks property. Because what we have in all the discussion with Glenn was, we have a yes, no, yes. We granted access to the Parkway for that little bitty postage stamp up near Savannah. We have a development that's gonna have 3 times as much office space on it, on Woodland Oaks, and we didn't allow them access. And then we allowed access from the school district. So, you know, you were talking fairness and equitable. Is it fair to the guy on Woodland Oaks not to have access to the Parkway? He's got 200 feet, more or less. He could have had access on Schertz Parkway. And then in your discussion, you talked about, well, the parking lot at Clemens, well, that's going to be teachers. So we trust them to follow traffic rules as opposed to the students. You said we trust them more than the students because they're teachers and they're adults. Yet on Woodland Oaks Drive access, you don't trust the adults to make the right decision because we're afraid that there's going to be cut-throughs from Woodland Oaks through the development onto Schertz Parkway. So on one hand, we trust people, on the other hand, we don't. And we have in my estimation, a fairness issue because we grant access to a smaller lot, a smaller building on on Savannah, yet we don't on Woodland Oaks, and then we grant it to the school. So, you know, and like Glenn said before, they all say if there's a secondary access off of the arterial, stay off the arterial. So,
I will say, Commissioner, I think in hindsight, wouldn't have allowed the one at Savannah.
but we did.
I understand.
But we did.
Philosophically, this becomes the issue. So let me offer this, and you want to dialogue with me. We did, but I think we look at it and say we did that in error. Now, what we can either do is say, well, we did it once, so I've got to keep allowing it. And I'm going to be extreme here. For the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, however many countless times where we go, that was a mistake. Let's not repeat it. And we stop it. And answer for the fact that you let them, yep, in hindsight, that was a mistake. And I go back now to I think, and I mean this sincerely, and I can appreciate it, how much we value fairness really should affect how we write the code. Because if we aren't comfortable with making decisions that may not appear fair, may not at times be fair, not say we're always going to, not in hindsight, look back and say that was, then we really need to think about whether or not we want to allow that flexibility there at all. And I would argue you really need to allow whether you want an appeal at all. Because frankly, not just a matter of coming to staff, it's a matter of taking it to the Planning and Zoning Commission and even City Council when we do these things. Because inherently, when you allow that appeal valve, that waiver, that exception, you know, the code allows you all to make waivers. Y'all make waivers in some cases, you don't in others. Again, I think, concur with Commissioner Outlaw, we don't want to be arbitrary, we don't want to be capricious, we want to be able to explain it. Doesn't mean everybody's going to agree with us all the time, doesn't mean we won't look at it and go, that probably wasn't the right decision. But I think it really is important to make sure that inherently, if you're going to build in that, you're going to be open to this criticism of, you allowed it here, you didn't dare. And if we're not comfortable with that, and some communities may not be, then we really shouldn't put that in. We ought to set a standard. And I will offer, and here's the drawback to it, is we're going to err on the side of safety. We're going to err on the side of caution. There's means we're gonna have a fairly restrictive code, because we want it to fit in 99% of those cases. There are gonna be a lot of cases where we're sitting there going, what's the harm in it? What's the problem? And the answer is, and it's reasonable, we wanna value fairness, and so we don't wanna grant it in some cases and not others. I mean that sincerely. There's not a right or a wrong answer. I just think we ought to go into it eyes wide open. It's a bit of the, I've thought about this part of it, but I haven't thought about the consequences. Be careful what you wish for, it's the opportunity cost. And again, as I said, I think I perceive that and I appreciate it, that fairness is an important factor, and maybe should cause us to go one way with the code. And I think, I don't know that any of y'all have been on Board of Adjustment. It's what Board of Adjustment struggles with. Am I setting a precedent with this? Well, not always, if you can explain why you're doing it in this case. And yet inherently, the code has these relief valves there. Waivers you guys can provide, waivers council can provide, waiver staff can provide. There's some cases where you say yes, and some cases where you say no, and it's not always as quantifiable as we'd like it to be.
Yeah, precedent is hard. You know, as a patrol officer, I'd start out the shift saying, okay, 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, they're getting a ticket. No ifs, ands, or buts. And the first person I stopped going 12 miles an hour over the speed limit is this 85-year-old gray-haired granny looking at me with the, and so she gets a warning and not a ticket. Well, now the new standard is 13 miles an hour over the speed, so.
It's I think the issue we struggle with a little bit, it's you don't want selective enforcement of the codes.
Yes.
You don't want it, which I relate to arbitrary and capricious. If I don't have a basis for it, I can't justify it. I'm not treating everyone, and this is where I would say equitably, which is really understanding that everybody's got a bit of different. So again, my basic point was, yeah, in hindsight, shouldn't have allowed the one at Savannah. It was a mistake. Let's not repeat that going forward. Now when I compare this one that I don't want to allow and the school district, I see big differences between them that cause one versus the other. Frankly, and this is the irony on this, I was surprised we didn't get more blowback on the residents saying, and they may not have known, I don't want that traffic coming down our residential street, make them take access here, don't give them a thing here. I don't care if people do a U-turn here. It's not illegal. There's not a sign up saying you can't make a U-turn here. So what's the harm in it? I mean, that's the irony of what I thought they were going to make the case, is try to sell the neighborhood on, God, do you really want all this commercial traffic coming into your neighborhood? No.
Well, I went back and I reread the memo and the backup and all that from the April meeting, and going back through the notice, the response to the notices, and all the negatives. The issue was not developing the site. The issue was the driveway. That was the appeal. But when you go back and you read those resident responses, what they were objecting to was development and not the driveway. They didn't want the development.
If the developer really reached out, he could have leveraged them to say, we don't want the drive approach here at all because we don't want them coming into our neighborhood. That's a common dilemma that we face, and frankly, it's a dilemma that we're going to face here. It's the same thing we heard on the side up 3009 that I pointed to with that. That was what we heard. Residents didn't want that commercial traffic coming on their neighborhood.
Okay, everybody got all their answers now? Move on to item 6, requests and announcements. Requests by commissioners to place items on future planning and zoning agenda.
A question here for staff. Do we need to request an agenda item for the election of a chairman?
So that will be on the first meeting in January, which is tentatively
Okay.
scheduled for January 8th.
All right, thank you. I have nothing else.
Announcements by commissioners, city and community events attended and to be attended. Nobody? continuing education events attended and to be attended.
Mr. Acting Chairman, or anyway, I became aware, and I'm sorry I didn't bring the flyer with me, and it's really coming from the fire service. It's the Texas Engineering Extension, but in January, it's the 20th, 21st, and 22nd in San Marcos. They're having the annual Texas Leadership Symposium. And while a lot of the speakers are fire service people, it's not really geared just to fire service. It's more about leadership and skill development, and it's free to Texas residents. And if anybody, I registered to go. If anybody else would be interested in attending that, if you'll shoot me an email or call me, I'll be more than happy to give you the link to it.
I also forgot an announcement. This is for APA Texas, the Southwest chapter is having their holiday party on December 18th at 5:30 at Francis Bogside on St. Mary's in San Antonio.
Okay. Announcements by city staff, city and community events attended or to be attended.
So no events to attend that I'm aware of, but a couple other announcements. Like I said, January 8th is the first meeting. The master calendar was reviewed by city council last night, so that should be on the website here in short order, so you can see when the meetings are going to be for next year for P&Z. The October monthly financials were in the packet in Dropbox. So if y'all have any questions about that, just let me know. November and December will be in the January meeting.
New site plan applications? None? With that being said, no further business to discuss. Adjourned at 7:15.